Hi, I'm Kevin Hatley and welcome to Kevin Hatley Photography in my office. This is a channel that I've set up to share my experiences of wildlife and nature with others. So let's go. Hi and welcome to my new video on Kevin Hatley Photography on how to photograph dragonflies and damselflies. When I first took up photography a number of years ago, my main area of interest was birds, but the more time that I spent out in the countryside, the more wildlife and nature I got to see. And the one thing that did grab my attention was that of dragonflies. There are about 60 different species in the United Kingdom of dragonflies and damselflies, come in different sizes, and some of them in absolutely stunning colour. So they make great subjects for photographing, and I really do enjoy photographing them. So as I said, what I want to do is share my experience of how to photograph them, and what I'll do is I will share with you what I consider to be my top 5 tips on how to get a good photograph of a dragonfly or a damselfly. If you're new to the subject, then I would suggest that you do a little bit of research first. There's one book that I would recommend, and that's the Field Guide to Dragonflies and Damselflies in Great Britain. Other thing that you could do is maybe join a local interest group, which I did. I joined the Yorkshire Dragonfly group, and I was really pleased this year that they selected this picture of a female emperor dragonfly laying her eggs as the cover for the front of the magazine. Before we get into the meat of the subject, I think it's important that we understand the difference between a dragonfly and a damselfly. So dragonflies are generally larger than damselflies. The bodies are thicker, the wings are larger, and when at rest, a dragonfly will have its wings out, a bit like an aeroplane when it's at rest. The eyes on the top of the dragonfly's head are large, and they come together like that on the top of the head, and they cover the majority of the dragonfly's head. Damselflies, on the other hand, a lot smaller than a dragonfly. The bodies are slimmer, and when they're at rest, their wings generally tend to be parallel to the body, down by the side. There is one exception, and that's the emerald willow damselfly, I believe. Next thing that we need to understand before we really get into it is the life cycle of dragonflies and damselflies and where you're likely to find them. You're likely to find them in places like this, ponds and lakes and the surrounding vegetation when they go to rest. You'll find both species of dragonfly and damselfly on still water. On running water you will find damselflies, and one of the what I consider to be probably the most stunning damselfly, certainly most stunning damselfly, is the banded demoiselle, and I'll put a photograph of that here now. So where do we find dragonflies and damselflies? Generally speaking, you're looking for a nice bright sunny day when they're most active. Best time to photograph them is early morning, late evening, when conditions are cooler and they're generally at rest. That gives you the opportunity to get closer to them, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And here I found a pair of mating dragonflies, the male on the top and the female on the bottom. This is the position that they adopt when they're copulating. You'll see that the female, which is on the bottom, her appendage is just under the male's thorax, and that's where the copulation takes place. It's a migrant hawker. You can tell by this small triangle at the base of the thorax, small yellow triangle. I wonder if I can get right in on that. You can just see it there. Come out a little bit, blowing in the wind. You just see the small yellow triangle at the base of the male's thorax. Great to see. The life cycle of the dragonfly and damselfly are very similar in that the adults will lay their eggs, and the eggs will either float to the bottom of the water, or they will be laid on a plant stem eventually those eggs will hatch and they will become nymphs, and the nymphs will live underwater for up to 2 to 3 years, which is amazing. And then one late spring, early summer day, when the conditions are right, the nymph will then emerge from the water. It will generally climb up the stem of a plant, where it will then evolve from the nymph stage into the damselfly or dragonfly, leaving behind its exoskeleton. And here's a picture that I took only last week, which shows you the exoskeleton, whereby the dragonfly will then climb further up the stem. It will wait till it then dries out, and then eventually it will take off and its life will begin as a dragonfly or a damselfly. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to look at the equipment that I use for photographing dragonflies and damselflies. We'll look at the cameras, lenses and the support equipment that I use. When it comes to camera equipment, I'm a Nikon shooter, and I own 2 Nikon cameras. First one is the Nikon D850, and I pair that up with a Nikon 200 to 500 5.6 telephoto lens. The reason that I go for the 200 to 500 is that it gives me a greater range, shooting range for getting close to the dragonflies. It means that I can stand back away from where the dragonflies are and zoom in tightly to get a good picture. So D850 paired with the Nikon 200 to 500 5.6. My other camera is the Nikon D500. It's a fantastic wildlife lens. It gives me 10 frames per second, and I pair that with a Tamron 70 to 200 f2.8 telephoto lens. With the D500 being a crop sensor camera, that in effect gives me a focal length of 105mm to 300mm on the telephoto lens, and this is the lens that I would use for photographing dragonflies in fight. So D500 paired with the Tamron 70 to 200. And finally I have a Sigma 105mm macro 2.8 lens, and this is the lens that I'll use when I want to get up real close to the dragonflies to get good, close, intimate photographs. In addition to using telephoto lenses to get close to your subject, i.e. the dragonfly, there is another option that you can use, and that's to use what's known as extension tubes. Now, an extension tube is simply a tube, and as you can see there's no lens or anything there, and what that does is it gives you separation between your camera and your lens, which then allows you to get even closer to your subject. I don't tend to use them. I tend to just use the power of the telephoto lenses that I have. If you do want to use extension tubes, I recommend that you go on YouTube. There's plenty of good videos on there that show you how to use them. So extension tubes are another option. Okay, we've now looked at the cameras that I use and the lenses that I have at my disposal to photograph dragonflies and damselflies. What I want to briefly talk about now is how I actually support that equipment. The first and most obvious way is by hand holding, and that's whereby you can get right tight and close to try and get your picture. But the nature of the beast as such with dragonflies is they're very skittish, so getting close to them is quite difficult. So I think that the best option is to use a telephoto lens. That allows you to stand back from the dragonfly, zoom in, and compose your picture and get exactly the picture that you want. So first option is a tripod. As you can see from this tripod, it's quite a large tripod, which in itself can make it quite difficult getting into places where you've got tall grass, lots of bushes, etc. So tripods can be kind of difficult to use in that type of terrain, and I would probably limit my use of a tripod to either first thing in the morning or last thing at night when the conditions are a lot cooler and the dragonflies are at rest, or going to roost, or just coming out of roost. So tripod is an option. Okay, another tripod option that I have is this small, what I would call desktop type tripod. I use this mainly for photographing birds from hides. extremely good for dragonflies, for when you want to get low to the ground and close to your subject. And I'll demonstrate that to you when I talk about how I actually set myself up to photograph dragonflies and damselflies. So this small tripod, excellent piece of kit. The other option is to use a monopod, and for me this is my preferred option. This monopod comes with 3 stabilizing feet on it, and what the monopod allows you to do is actually maintain a stable platform but get close in to your subject. The important part being making sure that you keep your camera as parallel to the subject as you possibly can. So I find that the monopod for me is the best option for when you're photographing. Shooting with telephoto lenses means that you're at distance, means that you have a very shallow depth of field. So one very important point to take into consideration is that what you need to try and do is get the sensor in your camera, which sits at the back of the camera. You need to try and get that parallel to your subject, so at right angles to your subject. Whether you're photographing down onto it or across to it, try and get the sensor at the back of the camera at a right angle to your subject. And that way you should get a good, clear, and sharp, in focus picture of your subject. Okay, what I want to briefly do now is just talk about the camera settings that I'll use. If you take whether it's the D850 or whether it's the D500, generic settings, will shoot evaluative metering mode. I'll have an auto white balance. I always shoot in raw, and I always shoot in manual. There are basically 3, what I would say, classic photographs of dragonflies. That's the dragonfly at rest with its wings open or parallel if it's a damselfly. There's the dragonflies or damselflies whilst they're copulating. And finally there's the dragonflies in flight. So basically you've got static subjects and you've got moving subjects. So for a static subject I would be looking at an aperture of about 5.6, shutter speed of about minimum 500th of a second, and I always shoot on auto ISO. So that's for static subjects. So 5.6, 500th of a second, auto ISO. For dragonflies in flight, which are extremely difficult to do, you're looking at a minimum shutter speed of, I would suggest, 4,000th of a second. Again, I would set my aperture at about f8, just to give you that little bit more depth of field. And again, I'll shoot on auto ISO. Okay, we've looked at the camera equipment that I use and the support equipment that I use to operate that equipment. What I want to do now is go through what I consider to be my top 5 tips on how to get closer to dragonflies and damselflies. Okay, tip number 5 is to try and avoid the hottest time of the day to photograph. Dragonflies are at their most active during the heat of the day, so it's around about midday, but then the sun's very high in the sky and you can get pretty harsh photographic conditions then. So the best thing to do is to photograph dragonflies and damselflies either first thing in the morning or last thing in the evening when it's cooler and they're less active and they're at rest or they're going to roost. Tip number 4 is to move slowly but deliberately. Dragonflies have fantastic vision. They're constantly on the lookout for predators, so any sudden movement is going to give concern to the dragonfly and they'll be off. So take your time, slow things down, and be careful of your appearance as well. And I wear this kind of kit all the time. I would suggest that you wear drab coloured clothing. I always wear these gloves, the thin gloves, but they hide the shine that comes off my hands, and that's another tip there. Tip number 3 is watch your silhouette. As I've said, dragonflies and damselflies can be quite skittish, and your silhouette and sudden movements will give the game away and the dragonflies will be off. Okay, tip number 2 is to try and find some perches. Dragonflies and damselflies will often return to the same perch time after time. So if you can find a good perch which has got a really good background to it, which is also important when we're photographing them, then that's the one to sit and wait out. So try and find some perches. As I said, they'll often come in, land on the perch, and take off and come back again. And that's the opportunity to then get the photograph that you want. And finally, tip number 1 is just sit and wait and be patient. Get a nice comfortable position where you can sit down or even lie down, ready to take your photograph. But as I said, nice sit down, comfortable position, onto a perch, and just sit and wait. Okay, thanks for watching this edition of Kevin Hatley Photography and how to photograph dragonflies and damselflies. I hope at least somebody somewhere out there has learnt something from it, and if so, I've achieved my mission. All I would ask is that if you've liked it, could you hit the like button? If you would like to see more, could you ask you to subscribe to my channel, Kevin Hatley Photography. It's completely free, doesn't cost anything, and it just keeps me coming out into the beautiful English countryside and photographing the wildlife and nature. So until the next time, stay safe, take care, and I hope to see you soon. Bye for now.